Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really glad to have with me once again Richard Maybury. And as most of you know, Richard is the author of Richard Maybury's U.S. and World Early Warning Report. It's a monthly newsletter that I look for enthusiastically every month to get because there's always unique ideas and investment ideas as well as a perspective of where our country is. Because, you know, in order to understand where we are today, you need to know something about the history, and I don't know of anybody who knows American history better than Richard Maybury. Richard, thank you so much for being with us today again.
Oh, I always enjoy it, Jay, and incidentally, thank you so much for being one of the very few people out there in front of the public who actually understands the system of liberty and believes in it and tries to defend it. I wish there were 1,000 like you.
Yeah, I wished we didn't have to think that we had to go around and beat the hell out of everybody around the world in order to remain safe here in America. Yeah. Wouldn't it be nice if we kind of decided to just protect our own borders, perhaps, if somebody intrudes on us instead of us intruding on others all the time? I mean, this is part of what I was just talking to Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute of Peace and Prosperity about. And also, I know that you've talked in the past about the Founding Fathers were keen to protect our liberties, at the start at least. They were keen to protect our liberties domestically, but they didn't care too much about what we might have done overseas. And my question to Daniel was, don't you think that might have something to do with our loss of liberty domestically here? If we're going around the country, I mean, the whole blowback thing that Ron Paul talked about, 9/11, the reason they're over here is because we're over there. I mean, I think you probably believe there's something to that.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm speaking from experience, too. I was in 3 of the federal government's foreign wars. They were in Central America in the 1960s. And I saw what we were doing. You know, I was in the Air Force, and I was part of the attempt to wipe out various groups down there that were the enemies of the dictators that Washington was backing. Uh-huh. And it's awful that Americans just don't know. In Central and South America, for instance, what was going on in the U.S., or what became the U.S. back in the 1800s, the extermination of the American Indians, is still going on south of the border, from all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. Those governments are still fighting the Indians. And there are Indian tribes down there that we helped to massacre when I was in the Air Force. It's an outrageous thing, but nobody tells Americans what the federal government really does overseas.
Yeah, and that's so alien to the spirit of the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. But, you know, Richard, I'd like to review a little bit, have you talk to our listeners a little bit today about history and about the beginning days of our was a republic, now it's an empire. It was never supposed to be a democracy, as you point out. Mm-hmm. But before we go any further, it's earlywarningreport.com. If I didn't tell you that, folks, and be sure to consider subscribing to Richard's letter, because it's just absolutely excellent in terms of giving perspective. Now, I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about what's in his December letter, especially with regard to the early days of our republic. Talk to us, Richard, a little bit about the Articles of Confederation, starting with that point in time. What did our country look like then? And then as the next several years unfolded, talk to us about what happened.
Okay. There was an America long before there was a federal government. The so-called British colonies that were established here and were called America existed for centuries before the federal government did. It wasn't the federal government that created America. America already existed. What became the state governments were the government of America back then. And when the revolution broke out, the Americans were looking for a way to throw their government out of America, throw the British government out, because they were British. They were trying to get rid. It was a rebellion, a revolution to get rid of their government. Well, they decided to set up their own new government, which was the Articles of Confederation, and that carried them through the revolution, got the job done. And it was a really tough job.
Yeah.
So the Articles of Confederation worked pretty well. But when the revolution was over, the people like James Madison, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, who are called today, they're called the Federalists, they realized that the state governments had become too democratic and they were a threat to liberty. And we're taught today that democracy and liberty are the same thing, but there's nothing is further from the truth. Democracy and liberty are opposites. And if you think about it, you can see it. How can a minority be free if the majority can decide their fate?
Right.
So the Federalists understood that, and they were afraid that the system of liberty was being undermined by democracy, and their solution was to lay another layer of government on top of the state governments to try to create a balance of power so that there would be something holding those state governments down and keeping them from being democratic enough to ruin everything. Mm-hmm. So they demanded or I guess you'd say maybe requested, a new constitutional convention be started in 1887 to make some changes to the Articles of Confederation. But what actually happened was they simply overthrew the entire existing structure. They had George Washington come in. He was probably the most popular person in the country, and promised him that, if you take part in this, you get to be president. So Washington did, and the Army backed Washington, and the Constitutional Convention came out with what's called the Constitution that we think about today. That Constitution was a military coup. It's never painted that way by the government-controlled schools, but essentially the Federalists pulled off a military coup and put General Washington, in charge of the new government, and that government did have the effect of squashing a lot of the power of the states. It worked the way they wanted it to. Maybe not perfectly, but it sure did paralyze the states and keep them from being too tyrannical, too much mob rule.
Yeah.
It worked really great, for a long time, but essentially the people who are interested in political power, the power junkies in the country, eventually got control of the federal government, and so we have this monster that we have today, this very heavily socialist, that has almost unlimited power over us. We're all afraid of it. I mean, any rational person is scared to death of the federal government because it has essentially unlimited power. I listened to a little bit of your interview a few minutes ago, and I think you pointed out that the NSA and all these other agencies, they can just get into your life anytime they want and do whatever they want with you, and you essentially have very little rights left as an American. All you have is permissions, which is not the same thing. You don't have a right to freedom of the speech. You have permission to speak. You don't have a right to freedom of the press. You have permission to publish, and so on. And those permissions can be revoked at any time they want to scream national emergency. So this is no longer America, I guess, is what I'm saying. Yeah. The work of the founders has been undone over the last 200 years, and this is no longer the America that it was for let's say the whole 19th century and a little bit of the 20th century. We've got a government that is the most powerful ever seen on Earth, and the founders would be terrified of it. I mean, they'd be scared out of their minds. They'd all be leaving, I think, and going somewhere else.
We make King George look like a pussycat.
Yeah, that's really true. One thing that Americans are not taught in the government-controlled schools is that the federal government meddles in every other country. There is no country on this planet that the U.S. government does not meddle in. And my researchers and I, we spent months one time working on this, trying to find a country where the U.S. government doesn't meddle in their politics. And there simply is none. And most of that is what's called foreign aid. Mm-hmm. When the federal government pours money into some country, what it's doing is subsidizing the government of that country, because that enables the people who are already in power to say during the next election, hey, you better vote for me. Look at all this largesse that I got from the Americans. Well, if you want that money to keep flowing, you better vote for me. So foreign aid, which goes to practically every country still these days, is really a way of rigging other people's elections.
So we rig other people's elections, keep the people in control that our leaders want to have in control. Does that get then perhaps some commercial rights that we wouldn't otherwise have, perhaps intruding in their own economies, such that our corporations might get a leg up on their own, and or what? There's got to be something more than just power. I know you're big about the power junkie thesis. I mean, that's really what you think is going on to a great extent, but there's probably a lot of other things too, economic things that come into play as well, I would guess.
Oh, sure. Once you've got a center of power where people have the ability to essentially ruin you, then you had better be a friend of those people. Mm-hmm. And that's a lesson that goes back thousands of years in history. Whatever government is in power, if it's very powerful, then you've got to be a friend of that government. You've got to somehow influence that government, or they're coming after you. So, every big corporation has learned this. I think most wealthy individuals have learned it. It's just a fact of life. If you study enough history, you realize that to be without connections in Washington is to be in a high-risk condition. So it is true that once they've got their connections, they use them to milk the taxpayers and do all sorts of other things that have more money flowing in their direction. But I've never met a business person who likes being hooked into Washington. It's like Trump says, it's a swamp. Nobody wants to wade through that swamp. And business people generally hate it, but they're forced to do it. And once they're in there, they just take advantage of whatever opportunities arise.
Right. Once they're in there, the big guys can comply with the regulations and stuff too, which is so it has its winnowing effect, getting rid of the less competitive or the smaller investors, getting rid of competition too. So it has that effect too, I would argue, against our free markets, for sure. Richard, I'd like to ask you, going back to this, I'm sure you've given some thought to this, being the historian you are. But what if we had kept the Articles of Confederation? Would have that been better, in your view?
Yeah, definitely. For one thing, the Articles of Confederation relied almost entirely on militias for the defense of the country. In the militia, a good working definition is people between the ages of 18 and 50 who are your ordinary citizens walking down the street every day, but they're trained as soldiers, and they're equipped as soldiers, they're organized as soldiers, and if the country is in danger, they will turn out and defend the country. It was mostly those militias that won the American Revolution. Uh-huh. Washington and the federal government, what was it called? Anyhow, Washington and his army were given most of the credit, but actually the militias did most of the real work. And the Articles of Confederation relied on that. Well, militias can't be used to march off to somebody else's country and invade somebody else's country, because they're the people that are growing the crops and doing all of the other important stuff.
Yeah.
So it's a fantastic system. It's wonderful for defense, and it can't be used to get into other people's wars. If you don't believe me, study the history of Switzerland, because they have that system.
Yep, that's their system. So we had to start with 13 colonies, 13 countries, essentially.
Yes.
And then each of those would have had their own militia, and if one tried to attack another, or I suppose if there was an outside power, like if England come in to try to take back their 13 colonies, they would have come together probably to protect themselves.
Yeah. Early in the Revolution, some of Patrick Henry's speeches were devoted to exactly that, saying the people in Massachusetts, for instance, were already fighting the government, and we people in Virginia had got to help them. And his speeches were successful in rallying all of these militias to go help the people in the North fight off the government.
All right, Richard, we're going to be running out of time before we know it here. I want to ask you about some economic things. I have to ask you, I've been around long enough I was, a young man, admittedly, when we still had a gold standard. But if we had retained some sort of semblance of honest money instead of this fraudulent monetary system that we have now where money is created out of nothing and then used to redistribute wealth to the people that create it and control it, Washington, the bankers, we could have avoided a lot of the problems we're in today, though. I think you would agree with that, probably.
Oh, definitely. It would have been impossible for the government to go into countries all over the world and make more enemies for us, because they would have had to pay cash on the barrelhead.
Yeah, right. Or tax us for it. The Americans wouldn't have liked that too much.
Right. So it's the subterfuge of inflation, the ability to essentially counterfeit dollars that enables them to do an awful lot of this intervention in other countries, getting involved in other countries' political situations, and then getting us into wars. I think gold is absolutely essential for real defense, because people aren't going to turn out to defend their country unless they're really, really sure of it. The government can't go hiring a professional military because it can't afford it, unless there really is a big threat that the people are willing to get behind and organize to go after.
Yeah, honest money would bring about honest geopolitical policies domestically and overseas. I would argue. Well, we don't have gold. We have money that's being created infinitely. Massive amounts of it. The debt, the country's in a horrible position, notwithstanding a stock market that is going up. When we really look at the reality of it, Richard, you and I believe, I think I'm safe in saying you believe, that we're in big trouble. And one of the things you talk about that most Austrian school economists don't talk about so much is velocity. And I noticed in your latest letter, you are ramping up a little bit at least the velocity. That is the loss of confidence in the money. It causes people to turn the money over to buy things, not to hoard it, not to sit on it, both domestically and internationally. What did you see, or what are you seeing now that causes you to think that we're having a pickup in velocity, which should result or will result, all other things being equal, in higher prices? What are you seeing now that has you a little bit concerned about velocity?
Both the price of real estate and the price of stocks. Together, we've got two really big booms going on there. There's money flowing into those markets. Well, where is it coming from? It's the money that the federal government printed back there, starting in, I guess, 2009 or so. For years and years, they were printing money like crazy to try to undo the disorganization that Federal Reserve policy had created. They're trying to prop up things that were trying to go broke because they shouldn't have been created in the first place. So we now have all of that money that's been printed up, which was mostly sitting in the banks. It's coming out, and it's going into real estate and stocks. We are told by the news media and the government that when the government creates money, it just descends on the economy in a uniform blanket and everybody gets some share of it. Well, it's not true. It goes into specific locations, and the specific locations right now that it's going into are real estate and stocks. And I think what you're seeing there is people are starting to unload the dollars that they don't trust very much, and they're buying things that they trust more, which is real estate and stocks. They believe around the world people are pouring money into the United States because they believe that they'd rather own something real than this paper trash that these governments put out. So I think actually, we're much closer to a runaway inflationary boom than anybody really realizes. When you keep seeing the stock market going up like it has been, that one way to look at it is that stocks are going up, but actually, I think it's a picture of money going down.
Right, that's right. And I think that's the reason you need to own real money, gold and silver and that sort of thing. You mentioned also, with just a few seconds left here, that platinum is on a tear now, Richard.
Palladium.
Or palladium, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a shortage of palladium coming out of Russia and other suppliers, South Africa and so forth. But it's, again, I think that though the velocity side of the demand side may be part of what's going on. I'm noticing also in my inflation deflation watch, which I have in my newsletter I keep track of it every week, that we're seeing a breakout in inflation as well. And that includes stocks and bonds and commodities as well. So I didn't find it surprising. I'm much in agreement. My gut feel is that we are heading for some inflation, and because the money is turning over, people are saying they're not sure they want to hold this worthless paper, as you say again. I know there's so much more to talk to you about. Your investment strategies, defense stocks for sure have been on a tear. You've done very, very well. You point out in your newsletter that, and you point out names and things too, different companies that you talk about from time to time that have done extremely well. We've had discussions before about defense stocks and the morality of why it's not immoral from your point of view to hold those stocks of companies that kill people. That's a discussion for another day, but you do provide some good rationale for that, for sure. And I know that you really keep track of these things. You provide good, concrete ways for people to protect themselves, their wealth, and their families. So I would suggest very strongly people go to earlywarningreport.com, learn more about Richard's work. We'll try to have him on this show now and then once a month if possible. Richard, thank you so much for being with us again. We do have to go now. We'll look to do it again sometime soon. Thank you very much.